Hey y'all, welcome to the Clock Tower. I'm Colton here with Brandon. We are joined by Carmen from Pittsburgh, Weiss Schwarz and Strictly Broken.
But
So Carmen, you did a video a little while back on the Pittsburgh channel. We'll link it in the description. About Lost Format, which is a format playing Weiss that isn't Neo standard. Obviously, everyone who's watching this, you should go watch that. This video is going to be all about Lost Format, and if you haven't seen that video, you're going to kind of be in the dark a little bit. But for those people who maybe haven't seen it, Carmen, can you give like a brief primer on what Lost Format is and why it exists?
yeah, sure. So the idea behind Lost Format and the reason Nico and I decided to call it Lost Format is because it's the format we lost, to COVID. We did not get a chance to actually play this format in the English meta. So it's 2020 format. It is cut off at when Worlds 2020 would have been, which is early 2021. So January 31st, 2021, and backwards, which I believe the most recent set is FGO Babylonia, and backwards is what's legal for play. The point behind it is to, slow the game down, bring you back to a time where you weren't worried about dying from 2-2 very often. And the games had a couple more turns in them on both sides, somewhere between like 2 to 4 turns on average on both sides, more than we have now because the game is so fast. That was basically the idea behind it. It's kind of like Weiss Edison, if you're familiar with that from Yu-Gi-Oh.
Yeah, the meta's in a weird spot right now. I think a lot of people agree that, as you said, the game's moving really fast, a lot of very powerful top ends. It's super easy to just lose the game in deck one because your climaxes were in the wrong spot. And this format mitigates some of that by slowing the game down, like you said. And I think also these games are a little more skill intensive when the cards aren't just good, when your strategy isn't just play good card that does good things, but rather it's more dependent on the interaction between the cards. I think that requires more skillful play. And I
There's a
think
lot
more
less
interesting.
overloaded utility.
Hmm.
And the lower overloaded utility, and especially the lack of premium on death like super pluses, like stuff
Hmm.
like Aqua, like La Plus, like on death plus twos that kind of let you just like throw out your cards early and expect to get them back most of the time. You have to play with a lot more forethought. I think forethought is the right way to think about it more than skillful play, because I think there's skillful play in the modern game as well. But I think you had to play ahead a lot more back in this meta when things didn't kind of hand you everything on a silver platter. No cards like Mio or
Hmm.
Yui drop search in this meta.
And it also required you to make tougher decisions in deck building as well, because more profiles only did one thing, as opposed to these cards now that will do two, sometimes three things.
Yeah, there was a lot more expression in deck building back then, and I mean it's Weiss. It's always a little limited. It's kind of how the game is. It's very
Mhm.
there's packages and you lose slots really quickly. But even in something like AOT, where the list was so solid, people still had a chance to kind of like flex their tech picks and things like that, which is a good segue, speaking of, into probably the first deck
Yeah.
everybody remembers from back then is Attack on Titan, win 2K1, the tried and true Aaron level 1, Mikasa level 3. Still had that Armin that you're probably familiar with from the modern game when AOT released its new set fairly recently. That was still around. That was like a massive pain even back then. And then Aaron just being like this insane on reverse +2 that added this event that was effectively like an extra copy of every card in your deck. Was like a massive like reason why the deck stuck around for so long.
Yeah, plus two level one combos weren't exactly super common at this point, and they required reverses as well, which, a non-reverse combo now is basically unplayable because of the nature of things like Alice and now Slime, things that just, and not to mention standby boards that just build up massive numbers in the front where you can't get those reverses with a free level one. But at this point, this is pre-standby revolution, right? You had standby triggers, they existed, but you didn't really have a lot of standby decks that were relevant. So it wasn't impossible to get your reverses, and a legitimate strategy to playing into AOT was to try to deny its reverses by crashing board and playing things that, maybe went to memory themselves or, got somehow got off the board to try to deny that reverse.
Yeah,
So
AOT itself was so powerful at denying reverses for a long time. When on attack pluses were very bad, well, or not of the same quality as an on reverse plus, Aaron denying all that was like really bad for a long time. This is like long after that was like
mhm,
a big consideration in the meta, where Aaron denying, on reverse stuff was like, oh my god, I can't play an on reverse combo at all because everybody's playing AOT. AOT was still popular, and Aaron was always still around, so it's always a consideration. But he wasn't like running the meta anymore in terms of like the level one. So because there was a lot more variety. But the fact that Aaron was so strong, he could get so big. AOT has so much power to throw around. He could even get reverses against things like level 1 Goblin Slayer, which was like the number one like big costless power that people were
mhm.
contesting with at one back then. Aaron could even get reverses against that, and then continue to be squirrely, bounce back to hand, Omni Gear, moving things around. Very powerful deck, even back then.
And I think that's one of the things that is attractive about this format is that, yeah, as you were saying, AOT, there was a moment in time when AOT was just, the best thing on the block and it wasn't particularly close. This format that we didn't get to play, there was legitimate debate over what the best deck in the format was. And, we had just had the Weiss Invitationals, several months before that had featured 7 different decks in top 8. And that was, an invitational tournament that featured some of the best players in the world. And that tournament field was really diverse. And, we were expecting a really interesting and healthy meta for this season before COVID, kind of ruined the entire season. So that's another one of the reasons why I think this format is so interesting to a lot of people, including myself, is just the diversity of decks. And that's really what we're here to talk about in this video is these are all viable options to play, to some extent or another within this format.
Yeah, absolutely. With AOT kind of leading the charge on that, being that kind of reminiscent of time gone by, but also still kind of carrying that ability to really see play, especially in this part in time here, is why it's a good start for the list here. It's kind of an example of, hey, here's at least the minimum power threshold of some of the things we're looking at.
So moving on to Fate Apocrypha. I haven't had an opportunity to talk about this list in forever, but I do love this deck so much. It really only has one viable top end. It's the Mordred top end on Salvage. It has this really interesting and unique mechanic, which wasn't ever repeated in English, where you flip cards over in your level in order to do things. It's a cost that you can pay. So, for example, there's a level 1 archer that on play, ditch a card, flip a card over in your level, and you have salvage basically anything. Still one of the most incredible fixing tools I think that was ever printed in English. But that was a cost that would be featured throughout the set. You had cards that could flip cards back over in your level because when a card was flipped over in your level, you effectively lost that color, so you had to flip those cards back over. But what the Mordred would do was on attack, pay 2, flip over a card face down in your level, and burn equal to the number of face down cards in your level. So it would be like a modular 2, 3 kind of burn depending on what you had flipped over. Level 1 combo was usually the Astolfo, which was an Obero combo that when it got a reverse, gave itself the ability that when it was front attacked, it jumped back into your hand, which could deny reverses like Aaron. But also when it got its reverse, you could reveal the top card, and if it was a character, add it to your hand. So a double plussing combo on book, which sucked. But it also had this really robust level 0 lineup. It had good Ricky, good Brainstormer, all this other little tech stuff. One of the best on death Chiaris that I think the game has ever seen. It's just a 2K that Chiaris for any character that has one of the 2 dominant traits. So just really, there were good cards in Apocrypha. There were a couple of key profiles that was missing, most notably the CX swap. But I remember having success with this at the local level around this time because the top end at that time pushed just enough damage. and you could get enough advantage with the double plussing level 1 and perfect fixing with that archer. So you could fix into, all these really interesting early plays that you had. There were a lot of really interesting and good cards in this set. And I don't think the deck ever really got a great chance to shine because it would have been probably most relevant around the time the pandemic happened.
I did play in like the spring meta where this deck was around. We had it at our locals, and I had some experience playing it. Unfortunately, Astolfo is just a little too small. He's just a little too small, especially compared to Aaron, where like Astolfo's tapping out at like 65, and the pumps aren't as free as they are for Aaron. So, and the plus also isn't as good. Instead of adding an event that you add any card from your deck to your hand and move a card, possibly plus again on board. Astolfo plus back and then draws. And then, he's on book, but Aaron's all on wind. So it's like, these combos back then, you were playing a lot more for the combo than you were for the trigger. Sort of considering the trigger was like kind of like a big thing back then. So the fact that like Aaron was so good and Mikasa was so good on wind and 2K1 that deck could get away with it. But like the second the card quality went down a little bit, even something like book, like Astolfo, kind of showed how underpowered it was compared to something like Aaron. So it kind of could combat that. A big thing that you would see with Apocrypha is people would play the Jean level 1 with Wind, which is an on attack. It's a Magro. It has a stock condition on how much stock you can have. It's just an on attack check 4, which is okay. It also put you in yellow, which let you play Fafnir Dragon and a ton of other stuff at the top to kind of like go for some crazy burnouts. There's also another build, the standby build. It's kind of like Milky Holmes that ran around. I remember that deck topping in Mexico around that time. That deck plays, if you're familiar with the Milky Holmes engine, you swap cards in and out of your level, and when you do that, you have cards that plus you and mill you through your deck. And then the backup is typically really big to account for that drawback of putting like a climax in your level. So that was just another thing that was running around. But Apocrypha was never like too relevant, mostly because of the power lines, but it did have some interesting stuff. I think in trios around then was like that deck's time to shine, because you could push like a ton of pings with Fafnir Dragon and John and a bunch of other stuff at the end game, as well as also fire off Mordred because Fafnir went off in main phase, as well as healed you. And you had stock chargers, you had good cards like you said, Franchieri, stuff like that. But we unfortunately never really got a chance to see it.
Yeah, absolutely. Plus having all that access to that just kind of selectivity at the top to be able to kind of try to, when you're closing out your opponents, try to be as selective as possible with a lot of those burns or a lot of those pings for one, that you could definitely be very precise in that end game with this deck.
Also, flip face down is just really cool.
Mm-hmm.
That archer that flips face down to like salvage is still one of the most like ridiculous cards ever printed. So like there was definitely something there, but the set never really had time.
Yeah, I think you nailed it with that power level at 1, especially being on the weaker side of that. Next on the list was Adventure Time. We saw a couple different decks that came out of that set. There was the 8 standby build, focused on trying to stock charge early, trying to get those pieces to then be able to get the explosive shuffleback burns down at the top of that deck. It had some pretty strong mid-game pieces to be able to have that going through. The other side of that coin was trying to play with the Finn and Jake engine at the top, trying to, with that choice trigger, trying to get that additional burn and then cancel burn off with that, trying to get just the number of instances of damage to get stuck through, and then just kind of playing a variety of different combos to get to that point. It was more just trying to make sure you had the resources to get there. There was choice. Some people tried to elect with the standby. Others, there was the yellow stock soul, that all trying to do the same thing and get the resources for that end game.
Adventure Time back then would have been Space Age compared to a lot of things. Would have definitely been a standout It was a set that probably would have only really had a chance to go off at Worlds of that season because it came out fairly late in the cycle, I believe like November around then. So there wouldn't have been much of a chance other than Worlds. But at Worlds, like you got to think about back then, there weren't many 8 standby decks. 8 standby Adventure Time being like a legitimate, like insane wall deck back then. Not many things would have been able to out it. The decks that mix in the Finn and Jake. The Finn and Jake would have been the strongest finisher in the meta at that time. Like actually able to, like build up to stuff and like blow people out. Of course, other than Konosuba. Konosuba kind of in this league of its own back then in terms of what it was able to do. But Finn and Jake back then at Adventure Time was like insane. But Finn and Jake, for everything that was great about it, and even all the like stuff with Adventure Time that was figured out after the fact to play around this with stuff like the Demon Sword and things like that with the Bonder, really lean packages with that. You did have stuff like Memory Kick Counter and things like that to deny the fact that it was end of attack and things of that nature. So you actually, despite it being a legitimately insane finisher, there were ways for decks to like actually still play around it, which kind of like kept it in check. And Adventure Time was also classic for like missing certain glue pieces that could have it falter in the mid game that would kind of hold it back sometimes. But Finn and Jake, no one can deny that was probably be one of the best finishers back then.
Yeah, Finn and Jake, I think, is probably the most consistent finisher of this era, barring Memory Kick Counter. It was extremely powerful almost always. Like, if you got the full Finn and Jake down, you were closing from 3-0, which was not a lock back then. Healing down to 3-0 was super important. Like, it was really important back then that your top end healed because most combos didn't consistently close from 3-0. Finn and Jake is the first combo I remember seeing that literally just did pretty much every time because it had the cancel burn and the additional burn too. It was going to get there. And it was such an impressive top end. But like you said, it lacked the glue pieces. The level 1 game in the Finn and Jake top end never felt great. You were kind of playing standby without great standby targets, or you were playing this kind of okay salvage game. So getting there, if you could get there, it was fantastic. But it was kind of checked by its own mid game, I think. Although I do agree that I think it would have had a real shot at Worlds at the time.
Yeah, going into this format, Adventure Time is like one of the biggest dogs in the room, I think. Adventure Time's like pretty nuts comparatively. I think Adventure Time actually is one of those sets that loses the most from having that like COVID year that meta ripped away from it, because there was a time where Adventure Time would have been out where Dow would not have been, in terms of like, it's mostly just Worlds, because like I believe Data Live came out in March. So yeah, probably before, that next season kicks in. But like there would have been a stretch of time where Adventure Time, could have been the best standby deck, could have been like something like that before Dow came in and kind of, gave every other board deck a bit of a run for its money. We'll leave it at that.
So moving on to Excel World, I don't remember a thing about this deck.
Well, you punch yourself in the face to do stuff. Without climaxes was its thing. So shout out to Andy. Andy from Pittsburgh, Weiss Schwarz is a Excel World enjoyer, certified Excel World enjoyer. It was you clock yourself. This is back when Accelerate was always from top of deck. So it was an actual risk as opposed to just clocking yourself from the waiting room to set your own color like you do nowadays. So it's like not even real. But you would, expend your own clock, your own life to gain effects to plus. There was a on reverse. They were usually on reverse. There was like on reverse, you could accelerate to check top 4, add a card. On reverse, or accelerate at the beginning of clock phase. It was always at the beginning of like your battle phase. So before you actually, did the combat, it wasn't get a reverse, then clock yourself. It was clock yourself first, then you have to get the reverse. So your opponent has the ability to try to deny you. To salvage, which let you play like an early play on attack salvage combo. and then just your finisher. You just played the accelerate engine and stuff at 1. This is talking about like wind door with the early play Nico package. And then the finisher Kuriyuki Hime, just like a bunch of cancel burns, stuff like that. But the main thing with Excel World was definitely the climaxless plussing engine. So from going into 0 into 1, you didn't have to sculpt the climax. You had some time to find your climax for 2 to like play your early play combo. And then hopefully close out the game with Miki burns like Yo Burner and the Kuriyuki Hime finisher. But definitely like underpowered. The fact that it needed a reverse, and people were still playing Aaron, people were playing big stuff. You had to call your shot ahead of time, which was either really good or really bad if your opponent had a way to like deny that one thing in some way. Notably Aaron with move gear, which kind of gate kept this deck. Like AOT was like the biggest gatekeeper for Excel World for forever, but in this meta where things were starting to things were like pretty wide, maybe Excel World could have like snuck some wins in there somewhere, but definitely not a set that I would be expecting to see at like top tables or stuff like that, but was definitely super solid and unique.
What was happening in Bang Dream at this time?
Bang Dream's all over the place, like it always is. This was back when Bang Dream like legitimately was still a good enough and like wide enough set that you could really just jam whatever you wanted together in whatever kind of shell. I mean, Orisa was still super good in terms of like a big giant neg soul, because those weren't like as prevalent as they are in like every set like going forward, where it's like, oh, like a ton of sets get an egg soul and this one's good. The thing that Orisa had over the other prevalent egg soul at the time, which would have been Goblin Slayer, was Orisa had power in and of herself because she's a global 15. So people would be playing into Orisa. Of course, you could still build into Yukina. Birdcage Diva was still like a pretty insane finisher despite needing a reverse. But you had a ton of tools to get you there. It was kind of just throw whatever you want together and go. And we saw a lot of that throughout like the previous season. Like you go to the old top threes from 2019, and it is just like some level 1 combo, whether it's the Magro or the Christmas Cosme, into Birdcage Diva and like 30 other cards that are like the good Bang Dream cards. So you could really kind of do whatever you wanted, provided that you were playing like, the acceptable combos, because the set was so wide. Because this is before band locking really set in for the most part. There were still a lot of very general cards in Bang Dream. So you are always looking out for Buns for Luck, Stock Swap, and the Orisa Fumio into absolutely murdering you. That was still always what they were known for. So kind of almost like how it is today, but a little bit more all over the place. I think I remember in 2019 Springfest showing up and there's just Bang Dream everywhere, just like all over the place. Like Bang Dream is like one of the most popular sets being played, and like everybody's list is different. There's like door into bar, door into pants, book into pants, like things all over the place. So definitely super wide, but it's all about the buns and the Orisa, or just like Mocha back then, legitimately with like free fresh counter and other things, could actually keep you alive and like stall out the game like defensively. So that was another thing people were trying to do. So it was like Orisa Neg Soul, Mocha top end, Yukina top end, and then either like Christmas or like Yukina Book, whatever other band kind of deck that you would want to play were all fine. Like the Hello Happy World engine and stuff like that was definitely really good.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think Buns for Luck being one of those key card, especially that key card that everybody had to pay attention to, because that's ability to stock swap, kind of the before that finishing combo, made a huge difference, and to be able to do that from 2.
Buns is still one of the most powerful profiles in English. Like stock swap on a stick at 2 for 1 with no downside and no other conditions is extremely extremely valuable for its cost. And there's a reason that it still gets run. So moving on to card captor, Brandon. You spent a good amount of time on Card Captor.
Yeah, Card Captor, we actually did see around this time, namely in that invitational that we talked about earlier, Card Captor seeing some decent success, being able to make its way through, kind of relying in on those salvage triggers and trying to play in with money counter and with its effectively its early plays with its engine to be able to change into its finisher at 2 relatively cheaply regarding stock, kind of discarding cards from hand, but the changer also bounces back to hand, so you're able to kind of replenish for the next one. So you're able to kind of spawn in cards early. With those cards coming in early, there's a small neg soul attached with it. It also heals and also has like anti-burn with it as well. So it's kind of like really trying to play that defensive game, trying to slow that out, be able to kind of swing those vanilla swings in for the end game. But it is also, like many of these other sets, missing some kind of key pieces, that glue to be able to keep the consistency in play with that. So you're very reliant on making sure you're able to get a hold of those climaxes to be able to play them for either your combos or for that, especially that level 2 turn when you're playing down your early plays.
It's hard to play Card Captor sometimes because it's like you've got some really cool profiles, but man, you also have so few good choices to make it level 0. You're really struggling to make good hard choices for your deck at 0, and even honestly at 1, because you have you have a couple different ways you can play the one. You can play like the trial deck salvage combo, or you can play um, the change package from the level 1 into the level 2. There are definitely some underpowered profiles here, but that modular top end where you can, that variant top end where you can turn the 2/1 into any of those level 3s, a couple of which are actually pretty powerful. Though
Yeah, I think like
fun.
record and reflect were like definitely the strongest.
Mhm.
Reflect notably being the one that saw the most competitive success
Mhm.
from David. I think the one thing from Card Capture Sakura that's like notable is that 1/1, the block stopper promo, the unreversible promo. I remember that card being talked about a lot, specifically as like, this profile probably deserves more of a second look. And as that profile got power crept and continued to like get better, like have better effects on it, now we think about the 1/1 unreversible Nino and like how good of a card that was. I mean, this was kind of like the start of it, and this was just a vanilla 1/155, can't be reversed by cost 0. And that profile kind of proved itself back then as sort of a gotcha, where it's just like, I'm not prepared for this card because I'm not thinking about what I'm gonna do if I sit across from Card Captor Sakura, and this card sits on the board long enough to just give them enough time to give them that free plus to sort of get into the cards that they need, give them a little bit of time. That was sort of the whole idea behind it. But another thing with Card Captor Sakura that I think people forget, Card Captor Sakura actually had a extremely playable level 0 combo. Level 0 combos right now in the modern game are really strong because you can start firing them off really early and push damage really early. It was on book, but unlike a lot of level 0 combos at that time, it didn't require you to sack the climax or do something that would otherwise give you only 1 plus. You could get multiple pluses with multiple combos at level 0. It was an Akiho, it was blue. But because, Card Capture Sakura underexplored, really like underplayed and underrepresented, stuff like that never really got a chance to, shine. But there's some cool stuff there. Definitely more on the underpowered side, especially in terms of other mid-game decks, of which there were a few that were probably better than this and kind of bullied even Reflect and Record. It was still, it was unique and it had good flavor, which is more than can be said for some of the stuff that comes out nowadays.
So Grand Order, moving on, was the last set released before When Worlds would have been. It's kind of an interesting set. This is not Camelot, it's Babylonia. Carmen, what do you think Grand Order would have brought to the table in like a Worlds context that year?
It was just like better Overlord in terms of that strategy. I don't know if anybody was actually looking to play it, but it was the newest set at the time. it was Overlord with a real finisher, which, you know, might have been notable in terms of like that hybrid standby strategy that was still like, you know, I guess it's viable today. The last really crazy hybrid standby strategy we saw was Kaguya in the meta. I guess I don't really consider Ozkigura to be a hybrid standby deck. I consider that to be a drool and wait to win deck. But Babylonia was definitely like it was new. It might have like snuck in there at Worlds and got somebody. I don't think in terms of new sets premiering at Worlds it had a candle to hold to something like Adventure Time, but it definitely had some unique stuff in there in terms of a hybrid standby deck. Had some pretty decent like plays that it can make or choices you could do. So definitely not like a slouch. It had like, I think notably it had a like really good early play, the mash early play, that you could actually spam in the mid game. And if you were able to get that elongated game, stuff like Cocutus, which this set did have, really kind of riffing off that it's Overlord with a finisher idea. If you could get that extended mid game and kind of grind out those resources, it could have a very, very successful like grind out game with a real finisher to back it up in the Ishtar. But you know, it was just kind of the newest set. Unfortunately, a little underpowered compared to some of the other stuff around it. But that strategy really appealed to a lot of people, that kind of like Overlord hybrid standby thing. So being able to play kind of a better version of it might have been attractive to some people.
Let's talk about Fate. This is before Heaven's Feel 2. We're still on Heaven's Feel 1. The 8-bar list is still the primary build at this point. 8-bar really only died when Dow happened, I think, because Dow could just blink that whole board away, had no issues at all, denying its reverses and kind of mocking the Neg Soul a little bit because it wasn't hexproof. So, but before a lot of blink happened, Neg Soul top ends were extremely annoying, very difficult to use, or rather, very difficult to play into, and it actually ended up winning the Invitational the summer before. So 8-bar in this format, I think, would still be quite viable. You're looking at, the Sakura Brainstormer that rewarded you for hitting bars. You have the level 1 stock swap if you're in enough green. You have the stock swap event that you can play for 1 stock if you have, I think it's 4 green characters on the board. So you have access to stock swap at 1, and you have access to, a bunch of just good profiles that all kind of became not particularly usable as soon as you had to move away from the 8-bar package.
Well, you had the 8-bar support, right? So you had the Sakura Brainstorm that allowed you to be able to kind of convert bars into hands to be able to continue to keep going forward. Your Fate, you control your level, right? So you don't have to be level locked out of any level. So you can kind of basically get to 3 first to play down your riders to kind of basically block out your opponents from trying to close you out. And from there, you kind of use those to try to close the game from there. You have access to the pretty consistent early play package with the Elia and the Berserker being in clock. So you can kind of try to get to 2 and stay at 2, get to 3, stay at 3. So you're trying to just elongate that game a little bit longer. Your riders are on bar, so you're able to loop that combo more efficiently because you're trying to get that combo to hand from triggering it. You are definitely in a spot to try to control board, especially because they can't front into your characters with rider. As soon as you hit 3, you're trying to control board.
This meta would have been Fate's like true time to shine and just sort of run away with all the things that it had. All the things you hear about, like all of Fate's like mega copers that you see online that today, Fate's still the best. Fate's still the best deck. It's still awesome. All this stuff was true back then. You had like when Goblin Slayer, a costless level 1, is like kind of like the go-to wallet one. When you're the deck that slams 4 cost bombs, that deck's afraid of you. Slime was afraid of you for the same reason. Even like AOT or like Konosuba, you put these bombs out in front of them and they're like forced to start siding you. and things like that. It's like really disruptive for a lot of people. Shiro, like Avenger, was like truly the broken card that everyone says it is. Now we have like pluses that are so disgusting that saying that like every zero in my deck pluses because they're all masters and I play 4 Shiros and I open it like 80% of the time. I slap this card down and every zero in my deck is now plussing 0. Like that was legitimately like insane to say back then, and now it's like who cares? But back then that was like a legitimate insane thing about Fate, as well as the fact that you like completely controlled the push pull of 0 into 1 because of Shiro, because you can never be level locked. Like passing turn for like stuff like that. Yeah, yes, that is still a very powerful play you can do now, but now it's kind of like muted as to how powerful that kind of stuff was. Fate being able to completely ignore it by having a card like Shiro was like insane, and set up for their Sakura, which was like just an on reverse search that you played because it was a master and because it was on bar, and not because it was a stellar combo. It kind of helped mitigate that because you can always go to 1 first and snipe their zeros that they left out for you instead of trying to contest with something that might have been bigger.
And you had a free Azusa.
Yeah, Azusa Free Fresh also pretty broken.
Yeah.
Ryder, yeah, not having the blink. The spot off finishers back then were a lot more effective because you are actually able to grind out the game when you just need to like finish from 3-2 or 3-3. And then you have like a single caster restander or like the Fate Zero Rider or things like that. Cards like that, very techy off finisher cards, are a lot more consistent and actually finishing games when your primary game plan is to grind the game to a halt at 3 with Rider and just stop your opponent from fronting. I remember all the like hair pulling at how does the continuous minus 3000 work with like putting chump things in front of Rider. They just die, which is really funny. Like this deck would have been the true nightmare that everybody who still copes on it like thinks it still is, but back then it would have been real.
Fujimi Bunko. I remember when this dropped thinking, oh my gosh, that is so much power. How am I going to deal with this? What am I going to do with this thing that sits at like 12-5 cross turn? What am I going to do? Obviously, now that's, almost laughable, but at the time, that was really the thing that Fujimi brought to the table was I'm just going to sit here and just be bigger than anything you can throw at me. And it kind of worked.
Fujimi was definitely the biggest, and other than Adventure Time, which was the new 8 standby deck, which was a little bit more modern, it still didn't have the like crazy aggressive filtering power that like Data Live had. I don't think anything did. It had okay pushes for like filling grave and things like that. You had the Clockamagi at 0 to kind of fill your grave. They could like realistically going second, like be level 1 on their second turn if they like trigger for a 4 and clock and like play 2 Hanbeis and like put out a 2/2 on their second turn, which is like insane back then that you would like give up that much damage to put out a card like that. But game was slower. Even back then, this deck caught a lot of flack for not doing a lot. It was just like the 8 standby value engine. Looking back at it, it does look incredibly vanilla. It doesn't really do a lot. It plays a defensive counter and like puts out big bodies. But when you're one of the only decks that can do that back then, it's a little bit more notable and a lot more effective. There weren't many other decks as consistently putting out the big bodies. There were decks that had better targets, things like Albuta. But they didn't have the 8 standbys to put them out. They were only hybrid standby. Fujimi was like the most consistent at putting out that stuff because it was able to play 8 standby triggers.
Goblin Slayer. A lot of people have talked about how Goblin Slayer was one of the chief victims of the lack of a format during the pandemic. It came out, it was highly touted, people were very excited about it, and then it never really got a chance.
This set literally had its meta where it was the king, where it was the deck to be wrenched away from it completely. 2 different builds that I think were, it's more like 3 actually, that were in contention for like what you should play. There was Priestess. Priestess was definitely going to be like the Swiss Stomper at the time. I remember saying in a lot of videos and stuff back then, it's like, if you want to have an easy ride through Swiss, definitely just queue Priestess. But, you know, the better, like, as people get better and people start, like, teching against it, the longer the deck is good, the harder it gets, because, like, Negsoul is the easiest thing to, like, tech against over time. Because, like, you can, like, hate your deck against Negsouls, but, like, it does make the rest of your matchups worse. Stuff like that. And back then, that was, like, a big deal. Now it's like you put, like, one overloaded tech card in your deck and you're, like, good to go. But, like, back then, it was, like, a big deal to kind of, like, hate against Negsoul. Because the anti-Negsoul stuff, it wasn't like Blink was stapled to Shiro like it was a couple months later after this meta. You didn't have, like, built-in outs. So Priestess being this, like, global non-targeting Negsoul, even though she had a condition, she was easily early playable, easily spammable, dug for her own climax. Her climax was on, like, pants, had a really good level 1, a really good package with the Goblin Slayer. The level 1 Goblin Slayer obviously carried everything. There's the very popular door standby build, which, you know, I would be interested to see how good that build actually is in a meta, instead of, you know, everyone saying it's good for some other reasons that we won't get into. And then there was also 8 door, which was kind of quietly in the background, but was, like, an extremely consistent deck that came out of that set, because anything that was playing level 1 Goblin Slayer in that package was, like, a nightmare. The fact that that card was 6-7k costlessly cross turn, backing up to 8 or 9, like, we think that that's, like, normal now for, like, combos that, like, try to hold board cross turn, but back then that was absurd. And that kind of, like, set the marker at level 1. That was, like, the new power level threshold for costless combos.
Yeah, absolutely. That combo, especially playing in with that torch package, being able to mill through its deck a little bit more on command as well, being able to really kind of try to control its deck state as efficiently as possible was kind of like also its kind of thing as well. But being able to definitely have multiple opportunities to have different kinds of top ends, I think definitely would have been a little bit more explored and a little bit more concise if we had actually been able to kind of really play into some of that time.
Yeah, because by the time we were able to really play in person again, Goblin Slayer had been outpaced by a lot of the stuff that had been released in 2021. Gun Gale.
So with this deck, the most prevalent build that I saw during a lot of this time was the 8th salvage build, where you kind of run the essentially level 1 bombs on the salvage trigger to try to get some additional pluses that way. But then played pretty heavily into its early play packages, right? Being able to spam out essentially these big bodies at 2, trying to get all of these kind of basically burn damages in, kind of like an anti-burn one in the back. Just trying to really just try to stick damage consistently, starting from level 2 on.
So yeah, GGO 8 door. This is a hyper consistent deck that leverages a extremely strong level 0 game, going into, like, kind of muted level 1. It was notable for playing a bomb. Level 1 was just top checked on attack. You played 8 doors. No matter what you hit, you got a plus, which kind of led to that high consistency. It was a bomb, so again, all these things that were kind of like costlessly tanking up or maybe playing standby, you didn't care about because you were playing 4 bombs going into level 1. And then at level 2, you started to constantly spam out these early plays. It was notable for 4 stock, you could get 2 heals, and the one early play had on attack ditch 2 burn. So if you were maintaining hand size and you were, you know, triggering these doors throughout the attack step, and, you know, triggering multiple times back then wasn't an immediate death sentence, you could use that extra hand, attack with that early play that had the ditch 2 at the end on its attack, and sort of use that excess hand during the combat phase to sort of chip until you got to the top, where you played Insane Len, which is the name of the card, where you mill top 3. If you hit all characters, you get a free ping, neg your opponent 4k one place, 2k another place for every copy you play. And then on attack with a door, it's just Trouble Girl. And then, like, the rest of your early plays just heal. And it was noted that you played like 12, 13 level 3s, which back then was, like, incredibly weird you like played like just the 4 lens at one and a ton of zeros. You look at the deck now and it makes like a lot of sense, but back then it like looked kind of funky to people who hadn't played it. But it was definitely a low ceiling, but very, very consistent deck, and it like continued to put up after its release like a lot of placings and results because it was so consistent and slower. Definitely not one of the best mid-game decks at the time, but one of the most consistent ones for sure, and it had the results to back it up.
On the flip side of consistency, we have JoJo. I think probably would have done better if it had had an actual format to play into, but even when it came out, we kind of knew when it dropped that it wasn't expected to do a whole lot.
Yeah, JoJo's there are like 2 ways you can really take it. You can play the villains package with the standby, which is a double combo. So you have like a level 1 and a finisher. Both of which are like okay. The level 1 can get pretty big. The finisher can like nuke your opponent's board, which is kind of JoJo's thing. There's a lot of like board deletion in this set. And then you played standby mostly for value. Nothing really crazy there. And then the other build that I know that most of like people that like really mess with JoJo kind of came to, notably like Dean and like my one local Tanner, they really like Aerosmith. Aerosmith was another combo that at 2 just kind of popped your opponent's board. And Aerosmith back then, just deleting your opponent's whole board, including their back row. A lot of decks just couldn't recover from that. And there was enough time in the game, if you did that the second you hit level 2, that actually set your opponent back far enough for you to like generate enough value to kind of win the game off of it. It was still a risky strategy. Weiss was still Weiss. Your opponent could still just like hit 3 on a brainstorm and instantly be back in the game. So it wasn't like the most consistent strategy, but it was unique that like everything in JoJo's was like randomly popping your board. Whether it was at level 3 with the villains package or it was at at level 2 with Aerosmith. But that was kind of its thing. You definitely had to like know how to play around Aerosmith.
Yeah, absolutely. Having to bring along your own little booklet to compare your cards with the errata list.
Oh yeah, that and Fujimi were really bad with it.
But outside of that, yeah, having that potential board break opportunity to just really try to set some of these really board based decks in play to try to remove them from play. Yeah, that was definitely like the big drawing and selling point of this set.
Konosuba was one of the most popular sets at this time. All of its sets that we have now were out. So you can play full strength Konosuba in Lost format. There are a lot of different things you can do with this. The most consistent build might actually be the Darkness build, the Wind into Choice. But the build of choice for most people was some kind of level 1, either the Megumin Obero or Bunny Girl Union, into a level 3 package that featured the Aqua Fumio and the Burn 5 Megumin. Like that still was kind of the most popular way to play the top end. You had the other Burn package with the new set where you had the Union and the Megumin down, and they would essentially give each other additional burns and things. That was fine. It saw a little bit of play, but the OG Megumin combo that I think it was pay 1 burn 4, in addition to the Fumio, alongside the other Megumin that would bring down a level 3 for free and then burn 5. I think that was still the package of choice at around this time. I think most people had kind of moved on from the Legend of Crimson stuff at the top. But lots
Yeah,
of stuff you can do. Lots of stuff you can do with Konosuba. Like the Aqua build is fine. You can build some really weird stuff. Konosuba is a super fun deck to just like play around with because there are so many wacky cards, just strange events, super weird effects. My favorite Konosuba deck is actually one that's built around the 2/4 burn event, where you take 2 cards from your opponent's waiting room, put them on top, and burn 5. That's just fun. It's a deck that shouldn't work and does. The Wiz top end is kind of similar. It's an on play burn on an on reverse restander. So there's a lot of fun stuff in Konosuba. There's a lot you can do with it.
No matter what you do with Konosuba, though, it always ends in Fumio into powered up explosion magic, burn for 5. No matter what you do, that's the finish. I think a lot of the time. Also, like Seizure, like Foreclosure is like one of the most insane cards. Playing around Foreclosure was like actually legitimately terrifying. It's like a stock swap on crack. Basically, what this card does is it rips away your stock for the entirety of your turn. So if your finisher needed stock to work, like most finishers need, and you tapped all the way out and had to swing with another lane to get stock, even when your game was going like bad and fast, Seizure could just go like, no, you don't have any stock this turn. And then it stock swapped you because it put those in the grave. And then at the beginning of like at the end of your turn, you put all the stock from the top of your deck, like a normal stock swap, into your stock. So you lost all your stock on that turn and then got stock swapped at the end. And because you could do that, because it's an event that you could play in main phase, you could dump all of your opponent's clean stock to grave and then shuffle it back with Fumio and blow them up. Konosuba was like legitimately the only deck where if you sat down against Konosuba, sending them to 3 first was legitimately scary, and you might die from like the middle of 2 if they have enough resources. This stuff was extremely expensive to do all that, even with the powered up explosion, summoning a card from your hand to sort of make this stuff cheaper. It was still a lot of resources. Seizure was a 2/3. You're playing down a lot more. You got to pay 1 for the Fumio. The burn 5 has a pay 3 on attack. There's a lot going on there. They had to have a lot more resources than decks nowadays do to have to do that stuff. And that's just like, any deck going into this top end. You could play this top end in really anything. The Darkness deck played this package. You don't like, you just throw these cards in your deck. Konosuba had for that Darkness deck. I was actually pretty scared of that deck going into the current meta because, people forget that Konosuba had tap counter and defensive options and things to play with that Darkness package that would be really scary. But even back then, I think Konosuba was starting to show its age in terms of its level zeros. Its level zeros were never the greatest going into that meta game. So it was kind of going to show its age at 0, but from 1 and forward, there was some really scary stuff going on there. Konosuba, and you can always die. And like Ambush Union is still like an insane card. People still play the Bunny Girl Ambush Union package. Playing that Stock Soul combo that you almost never used, you always just killed with Burn 5. Because Union would just give you free cards all game, free cards and free deck control with the magic package. So Konosuba always a threat. There was also the 5-door 3 pants deck that I know we covered on our channel during the time that I was very excited to play during that season. Unfortunately, never got a chance to play that one either. I was a believer in that deck being like extremely, extremely absurdly strong. And like had almost no bad matchups at the time, but never really got a chance to play it and sort of prove that one. But maybe people can try it out in this format.
Yeah, Konosuba, another one of those sets that fell victim to no events during the pandemic. I remember the knock on this deck being, oh, so I get to play good. I play good Weiss and then I just get punished. I remember that being kind of the complaint, like, oh, so I'm going to play good Weiss, I'm going to compress, I'm going to do all this, and then I'm just going to get stock swapped, Fumio'd, and burned to death.
Back then we used to talk about like how Konosuba would put you in like a 3-way checkmate, and you could only ever play around 2 of the 3 ways. Yep. We complained about that back then and how that was like really annoying to play against, and kind of like a challenge to really hedge your bets against what was the best way to live given the game state, given how the game had gone, given what resources your opponent did have. And there was like a push and pull there and a lot going on. And now it's just like there's absolutely nothing I can do. I'm just praying I don't die. Please don't kill me. Please don't. I triggered 2 climaxes. Please don't triple Marine me and kill me. Exactly. Like, with no resources at all. Like it was people say like back then it's like, oh, Konosuba was still killing people from 2. It was so much different. Like to say that it wasn't is I think a little bit Disingenuous. Yeah, I think it's very disingenuous to say that Konosuba killing people from 2 back then is the same way it is now. It was very, very, very different.
You had to pay 3 for the stock swap, like you said. You had to pay 3 for the Fumio. Then you had to pay 2 or so you would pay the 2 on the powered up explosion magic to bring on the Fumio. You'd pay the extra 1, you'd pay the 3 for the stock swap, and then you had to pay 3 pitch 2 to get your burn 5. And that was all you did.
Yeah, all you
If the
did
burn
was
5
throw a
didn't work,
single
you
burn
didn't
5.
win.
Yeah, if the burn 5 didn't go through, nothing happened. So you wanted to back that up with more stuff.
It
And
cost an absurd amount of stock.
yeah,
It
it's
was
like so
absurdly
many
stock intensive
resources.
set. And that was always that was always the the big challenge for me with Konosuba. Like I played a lot of Konosuba back then, and it never felt like you had enough stock. It just never felt like you could get there. And sometimes you did, and sometimes you didn't maybe get all of the things you wanted to get, but you got enough of them so that you could open up your opponent and hit the burn 5 or whatever. But yeah, no, Konosuba is one of those decks where it's like it's super inconsistent, but it has such a high ceiling, and when it pops off, there's nothing quite like it.
Yeah, like the Bunny Girl Union builds were definitely like very consistent. But it was like Bunny Girl Union was falling off because she was having trouble getting reverses.
Yep.
Because Konosuba does not have a lot of good ways to pump power. So Union was always like doomed to tap out at 7K and was very easily deniable as a combo. But Konosuba is always still strong. There were many different ways you could get to your Fumio burn 5. And they were all pretty gross.
Love Live Sunshine. This is a set that's kind of been around for a long time, and not just because it's old. It's like been somewhat relevant even up through last year. I think this is probably the first year where we really saw Love Live Sunshine kind of fade into actual obscurity.
Thank God. This deck is like a nightmare. I'm going to take a page from Andy here. This is like Love Live Sunshine is the closest thing Weiss has ever had to something like Tron. It's just like a deck that never goes away, a deck that's always been around. It's like you put the pieces together and like you just get there. A lot of the time you're just doing like a high value strategy. You just outvalue whatever gets put in front of you, and you just like don't give a singular care in the world. You just do your thing. Even more so if you play like the Ruby 2 Soul variant. There was the Chica level 1, which was undoubtedly more popular. Had a lot more like actual plays you can make with it. Ruby, you were just like kind of rolling your face on the mat and really like playing into the like I don't give a singular like care about anything. Into the Chica Yo package, what the deck is most notable for. Similarly to GGO, you like play one of these early plays, this Chica, and then you pay 1 and it rips the Yo out of your waiting room. And instead of healing like GGO, the Yo is on attack, reveal, top, burn for the level of the card you reveal. So if you hit, you're just pushing extra damage at 2, which we think about now. There's plenty of cards that do that. There's plenty of sets that do that. Love Live Sunshine for the longest time was the only one, and it was banned in Japanese multiple times. This is a deck that just would not go away, even with Yo at 1, because that is such a like insane strategy for so long until the game power crept and caught up with it. Because it was kind of ahead of its curve, that's why it stuck around for so long. But back here, it was like truly still like an incredibly strong, like unending annoyance that this deck was like always around and could always just like randomly yeet you at level 2 when you were not prepared for it. Because back then, the fact that, it's level 0s, we think of them as dated now, and one of the main reasons why the set kind of falls off, where other than the Ruby 1-0 Azusa, the set has Azusa, by the way. Other than that card, everything else in the set is dated, but, rewind the clock and dated stops mattering, right? It's just on par. So the set ends up being very strong.
And it also had a Kanan that just let you kind of recur. Like as soon as you got Chica Yo down, it was like, oh, okay, we're just doing it again.
Yeah, it just doesn't go away. The saver, the
Yep.
Kanan saver is like an insane card.
And that really allowed it to be much more consistent than a lot of other, top check burn kind of decks we've seen plenty of top check burn things throughout the history of Weiss, but Sunshine is the one that we always kind of come back to as like the OG top check burn. We called them yo burns, right? Like, this is why. And also, it didn't hurt that it only ran like a dozen zeros. Like, you're running as few zeros as possible.
Yeah,
I took
the
this to New Jersey in 22, and we got top 8 with it. And I think I ran like 14 zeros. You literally were min-maxing, trying to squeeze as many level 3s in there as you possibly could. You're running a full play set of Chica, full play set of Yo, just trying to get, and you had the back row, the Rico, that would
Rico, yeah.
that would let you top check as well to make sure to try to find your burns. Like, it was so consistent for what it was, for something that literally is a roll of the dice and you're hoping to find a 3 on top. It was incredibly consistent because you could get it down pretty much every game at level 2. You had the top check as well, and you could, if it failed and it died, you could just bring it back and run it back the next turn. It wasn't even hard to do. So consistent for a deck that literally is just trying to high roll into 3s, but it could do that enough because when you take a lot of shots, some of them go in.
I was definitely like a supporter of like the more normal level 0 line Sunshine decks that didn't try to play the Mari. I played this deck for a long time. I have like a long history with Level Life Sunshine, where I played it for a long time, around this time, like during like pre-COVID and stuff like that. And eventually I just was just like I can't take it anymore, because like it's one of those decks where you can put a ton of work into it, and there are a lot of other players like my teammate Patrick Garrity, known for being like one of the most consistent Love Life Sunshine players in NA, like far and away, like one of the most consistent players on the deck ever. There are so many things you can do, but at the end of the day, if you are playing Weiss Schwarz correctly and you are compressing your deck, by compressing your deck, you remove the ability to yo burn more consistently. It's like a very frustrating paradigm back and forth, which eventually led me away from this deck, which I think people were starting to like catch on to around this time. But a lot of people don't care about that. Number one, it's idols. Idols will always be popular. And number two, again, it's like Tron. It never goes away. You put the pieces together, that you slam them to the board over and over. You outvalue your opponent, and eventually you just win.
Mob Psycho. This is another deck that it was kind of underpowered when it dropped. There were, however, some people that are having some success with it. I know Ian was having success with it before Dal came out. It's an odd package. It's got some interesting stuff going on, but it's definitely an odd package.
Yeah, it's new. It's really new at this time. Notably, Dal is not out. The thing for this set, I think, that really kills it is like Blink is so terrible for Mob. No matter what, you are either playing the Obero at 1, the yellow combo, or you are playing the Ritsu and trying to like build markers. Those are like your really only options in terms of like combos that do something. You could play like these other combos that like don't accomplish a lot. But it's either the Obero or the Ritsu, and the Ritsu builds markers, and the Obero, obviously you blink that, you lose your +2. So like you just lose everything with this deck by getting blinked, like at every level. Your back row for the Reagan top end that needs to have markers to work, it gets blinked, you lose them. Like all these things throughout the game, you get dumpstered by like effects that were getting printed more and more and more. But back here in this format, not a lot of those cards exist. There are a lot of things that are annoying. There's a lot of bombs and stuff running around and stuff like that in terms of building markers and things like that. But you have a lot more of a chance to try to put something together. Mob has a lot of tools to like play a really insane defensive game. There are decks that like try to put the Reagan out early with standby. There's obviously the really efficient restander package that a lot of people just played the choice into that. The choice pants was like sort of like the go-to deck, the like easy deck to build. I always played like Pants Door, like focusing on healing a lot, building a lot of markers. And if your opponent can't answer the markers, you're like super compressed. You can build markers really fast with like the Spoons package. And then again, like standby Reagan, trying to like put the 2-1 out at 1, eat a bunch of markers early and then standby out the Reagan and then give him great performance so that like you have this great performance check and rack that you ride out the rest of the game. So I think Mob, while Mob was, like you said, underpowered at the beginning, I think it lost its opportunity to do literally anything by not having this season. By losing this season, it lost its chance to like really ever shine. So hopefully some of Mob's strongest soldiers out there playing Lost format can put it up there.
So moving on to Overlord, obviously Overlord has been, pretty well trod ground in recent weeks because of the new Eins list that's about to drop, and pretty convinced that it's going to be quite powerful, myself included. It wasn't quite so powerful when it initially dropped.
Yeah, Overlord, I think it was definitely immediately overshadowed in this meta by like Babylonia in terms of like when it came out, when it was able to be played. But it does have, unlike Babylonia, I think it has, if things go right, a like more ridiculous mid game if you can get all these crazy level 3s out. Because you have like the giant like clock kicker that gives 1500 and things like that to like really kind of take over the board at level 2. It's just getting there is the problem, because without Overlord 2, you're missing a lot of the other stuff, like the modern stuff that makes that deck pretty consistent for standby. Notably, a second standby. You're like an 8. Overlord was notable for being an 8 standby deck that didn't have a second standby trigger. Because you really just wanted to play like 8 standby the whole time, but you really couldn't because you don't have the other four triggers. So I think Babylonia was definitely stronger by the merit of having a real finisher. But if everything went right for Overlord in the mid game, it could be pretty scary. But that's kind of where it starts and ends.
Because it did have some of those fun little tools where it basically had the Kermi light, right? The Evil Eye top end to be able to try to do some funny things with deck states, trying to kind of do that shuffle back burn strategy. But for the most part, yeah, it was trying to play 8 standby with only 4.
So I will take the lead on this one because I spent a lot of time playing Persona 5. I still have it, and I still try to make it work. It is most well known for the Joker top end. If your opponent's board is reversed or empty, or any combination of the two, then you get to reveal a card from the top of your deck. You'll pay 3, pitch 1, reveal a card from the top of your deck for each thief character you have in your front row. Usually it's 3, and then you burn for whatever that number is off that card you revealed, and you do that 3 times. It feels and reads really great until it doesn't work, which is often. It's not hard to get the board clear for the Joker burns because that is combo-less. So you run, instead of a combo with the Joker, you run the Ryuji combo that bounces things off the board and also gives cancel burn to something. It's on a stock soul, and the Joker itself gets really big. It also has a 2/1 that gives it an additional 3000 power. It's not hard to get the reverses. It's not hard to get the power and the removal necessary to get the Joker burns. Getting to the Joker burns is a bit of a challenge, though, because you don't really have great combos. You have a level 2 that comes down at 1 and can +2. One's a draw and one's a search. And then you also have the level 1 salvage combo, which top checks and adds if it's not a CX, basically. And if it is a CX, then you just you have to ditch off the ad. So the plussing in Persona is not great. It does run the level 1 event package that has a bonder. It's a mill 4. It's technically got a little bit of hand disruption. Your opponent is forced to ditch down, face down into memory, a card from their hand, and then draw to replace it. So it gives your opponent a card of memory compression, and there's some stuff in the set that lets you, use your opponent's essentially pay something out of your opponent's memory for an effect. But the calling card event package is probably the most interesting thing in the mid game, just because it's good deck speed and it top checks 4 and gets basically anything. So it has a bonder, which is important. So Persona's got some stuff. Like, it's got some pieces. Its level 0 game is pretty lacking, but the top end is at least interesting. I don't know. It's got some of the best art in all of English, and that's probably its biggest strength, is just that the cards are gorgeous. But the set itself it's very high roll, low roll. Like, you just kind of have to hope that it all works. There's not a great way to fix your deck. Like, there are some things you can do, like you can fix the bottom card of your deck in the mill all the way down to the last card and then know exactly what your burns are, but that's not an easy plan to pull off. You also do have the shuffle back, so you can potentially, send some targets back into the deck. So you can make the burns better, but that also requires you to plus in the mid game. So it requires you to draw into your level 1 wind, your level 2 wind combo. Because there's no CX swap. There's no way to just draw into the CX aside from just drawing it normally. So not super easy to pull off. If everything comes together, it feels great when it pops off and, swings for 3/3/3 in addition to its, normal combat phase, but most games it kind of feels like it fizzles.
If you're able to compress that deck down, be able to get down to like the last card in deck and last card in deck being a really consistent number there, because it kind of shovels back into the deck itself. You can flip that same card over and over and over again.
Yeah, like that's the play that you want to hit. That's like the god play, but it's so hard to get there. It's so hard to get there because you just don't have good fixing. It requires you to have an extra couple of cards in hand because you need all the mill pieces, usually the calling cards, and you need the thing that fixes the bottom card of the deck. It's tough. It's not easy. Like, it's doable. And when it pops off, it's great, but it's really hard to get it to pop off. So ReZero, a couple different things you can do with it. This was pre-Frozen Bonds. You had the Memory Snow set that came out in 2020. Memory Snow was interesting because it had some stuff that, in theory, could counter some things. It never really felt like it came together. But the OG ReZero list did some things in its meta.
Yeah, this is probably my favorite deck from this time period. Blue Yellow ReZero is like probably my favorite Weiss Schwarz deck of all time. I think people who came into the game around that time, who were like familiar with other card games, like ReZero definitely seemed like a kind of mid-rangey kind of deck. Not many decks at that time were really playing for like a heavy mid game, especially not 1K1 decks that played for a mid game. So in that, ReZero was kind of a rarity. The other, mid game heavy decks, they're like, standby or hybrid standby or something like that. But ReZero was fully in on this mid game strategy, didn't play a top end combo. And was a 1K1 deck, and it ran a really the blue yellow variant ran a really unique quote unquote climax combo. It's this 2/1 felt where you never actually play the stock soul that combos quote unquote with this felt, but if you have 5 or less cards in deck when you play it, you sack the felt, ditch the climax, refresh your deck, search a Rom, Felt, or Reinhard to your hand, and then spawn a 3/2 felt and give it 1K power. On that turn. So you free fresh play an early play, search a card. But you have to like clutch this climax in your hand. And then you play a level 1 combo that like mills your deck. So there was a lot of decision points in this deck. There was a lot of skill expression in this deck, whether you're going for a mill out your deck with Amelia, which is a on attack Magro, just a check 4 combo, or you were going to go for a first deck felt play, where you on your first deck you would free fresh with felt, play your 3/2 felt, and play your Rem healer. Both of these cards compressed your deck in different ways. Rem compressed your next deck by eating cards from your grave once you got reverses and getting bigger, as well as healing you, keeping you at 2. Felt ripped cards out of your current deck and put them in stock, and then also had on attack you can pay 2 and give any card on your board cancel burn. So that's really good at chipping out games, which is what this deck wants to do. anyway. They're both really good at elongating the game, both compressing you. Rem on your next refresh, Felt on your active deck. But because Felt ripped cards out of your deck at the top of your next deck, you had a lot of skill expression there in terms of what you ripped out and what you did. There was a Emilia that was a pseudo restander that would kind of sack a card on your board and spawn this puck. You only had to play one of that puck because Felt could put that puck in stock, and then you could pay it out the next turn, or you could pay 2 out at that time to immediately put that puck into your grave. On the turn that you went for that Emilia restand, the puck could be in your deck, and you could rip it out on that turn and go for it. You could obviously rip counters in your deck out, put them in grave, and then you had a card on-demand salvage, the Rem Bomb, where you would sack it and ditch a card to pick up important counter, stuff like tap counter, or ReZero's extremely powerful anti-change counter. They have like the best anti-change counter profile in the game because you can do it every single turn and still build resources because the cost is spread out in such a way, or as well as just get your tap counter to keep you alive at the top. The deck was like incredibly lean, incredibly fun. There were a lot of like you could really work people over with it. You had insane stuff like the stun brainstorm, if you guys remember that, where you could stun your opponent's tap cards and they couldn't stand the next turn. So you were like really just completely grinding out the game. You're like free freshing constantly, healing down, denying your opponent from playing early plays, constantly like eating cards you don't need anymore, both from your deck and from your grave, to make your next deck better. Definitely one of the sickest decks to ever do it. You could also play this deck with Door. Ram was also possible. You could do even spicier stuff. You could play it with Betelgeuse. And then obviously there were a bunch of other things you could do with the set, but the main decks that I think it was known for were Book Stocksoul and Book Door. But Book Stocksoul was definitely the more intricate deck, and it was a lot more rewarding to play than Book Door.
I think it was also the most consistent build at that point in time too.
If anybody's looking to get rid of SP Felts in English and you'll let them go for a reasonable non-collector price, hit me up.
Sword Art. A couple of different things that you can do with this. There's the OG Sword Art stuff, and then there's the Alicization set that came out, I believe, in 2020. There were so many things you could do with Sword Art even back then. Now it's, kind of streamlined down into Alice into X. But back then there were a couple different things you could do. Last Shot Xenon had one of the highest damage potentials in the English game at the time. The Alicization package was touted when it came out, but it never really did a whole lot in the meta.
It was just Riaz and WSI, but that was a deck people were definitely like more hot on going into BCS season, and no one really outside of him in that event really got a chance to like play it because it was long gone by the time we resumed play. Alicization had a whole nother set at that point, but mainline Sal is just like a value pile at this time. You're playing Zek and Yuki, you're playing either Last Shot Xenon or a ton of off finishers and like an empty Door, trying to play that Gara style. Playing Gara in English at this time without like the coin flip and some of the other cards that were in Japanese, Gara would have been a great pick at the time, but unfortunately those cards don't exist. So a lot of people are just playing like bar book into Last Shot Xenon with the Zek and Yuki. There were a ton of different ways you could take this. You could also play hybrid standby here. There was standby switch running around, but even then, like back then, the amount of interaction that standby switch had to do with the board opened you up to a lot of defensive stuff that nobody ever wanted to deal with. So Last Shot Xenon was definitely more popular. And you had like all the tools. You could do it any way you wanted to. But you have the most cards in the game other than Bang Dream. So you're the set that gets to flex them.
And you also had, the standby package existed. You had the Yuki level 1 stuff. Mother's Rosario existed, not in its current form, but there were Mother's Rosario combos even back at this point.
So also the splittable counter. There was like the split counter with the the sister Lifa back row, the Amagi, where you could play for like a costless level 1 wall game with like the swimsuit Suguha that would get like really big. And then there were also stuff with like the Una engine from Ordinal Scale. I know that saw some success, like a card that could like heal you as early as level 1 by running a very slim package of cards that involved the vanilla, just to get this like heal off with the backup, and then use it was like a 500 power counter, but a 500 power counter still kicks the Lifa act support, so you can actually get some counter power out of that. Which was definitely something that people messed with and saw some success. You could use so much with Sao because they just had so many cards, which back then was like really relevant, that they had so many options, where nowadays things are so strong that it doesn't really matter. But back then, like, you had so many different options, you could really flex what you wanted to do and what you wanted to bring in a tournament. You had like so many different techs, so many different ways you could take it. You could really like kind of truly build for what you expected to see, and see some actual benefit there.
Bunny Girl Senpai. This set is probably most well known for being short printed, so it was really hard to get. It had the SP Mai that just became one of the most expensive cards in all of English for a time. I don't know where it is now, but the set itself was pretty solid. I mean, the deck was fine. The deck was certainly playable, but it didn't get played in large part because it was so hard to get your hands on the cards, and like secondary market prices for Bunny Girl were just through the roof.
The thing with Bunny Girl around this time, in terms of like how the set played, it had the most insane cards to hit off of standby, and yet was another set that only had one standby. But what you did have, unlike all these other sets that only had one standby, was that Kaede was a plussing combo. She was on reverse, but you were a plussing combo on standby, which back then was insane. Standby was the plussing engine back then. Cards that comboed off standby rarely plussed. If you were plussing off standby, it was usually off an Amagi or something like that. Like Silica plussed back then, things like that. Like, but that was a very different kind of combo. This was a card in your front row that attacked like any other card, and on a condition, plussed you a card with a climax. So it was kind of the first, especially in English, that we had a card like that. But if you hit, you could put together some really disgusting boards. You had a ton of early play healers, one that was extremely spammable and might refund one of its resources, like for stock, to effectively, and swing, play itself for free, loop it every single turn. If you hit in that Kaede, and then you also had a Shoko, which was a 2 or less healer. So you would play that, kind of grind out the game, and then eventually go into one of usually 2 different top ends. It was like the Nodoka, which shuffled cards back and was like sort of the decompression finisher, or a Mai that like milled cards and burned for the like number of, I believe, level or something like that you played. I remember playing more of the Nodoka and seeing more of that. But the main thing you were worried about was that Futaba, this giant bodyguard, that you had to like really, back then, if they hit a standby and put this Futaba down and then like got hit to 3, they could like actually like completely stall out the game off this one Futaba that would just sit in the middle of their board. And then they had this other card in the back row that could like reset the level 3. And because the games, went slow enough, you could actually resolve that card sometimes. It would like heal both players for 4 or 5 or something like that. It was like a one-sided, what is that? The resurrection event from Goblin Slayer, where you could dual-sided with that, and you could heal down both players and sort of like reset the level 3 if there was like a damage inequity there, and go back to grinding out the game. But because you didn't have a way to really get into standby, and you had this insane target, but like no way to push for triggers, you were just kind of like relying on if you hit it. But like, you hit the game slow enough, you did have ways to kind of, hedge your bets on getting this bodyguard out and other stuff like that. There was also like the free stock engine that I know a lot of people played, where you could just generate free compression by playing a vanilla package, and the zeros were slightly lackluster, so playing the vanilla wasn't that big of a deal. You could just like get free stock all game to play more early plays and heal more.
And finally, slime. We only had one set worth of slime at this point, but we had most of the building blocks of the 8 pants list that has seen success even in recent seasons. Brandon, you're the resident slime player. What do you do with set 1 slime?
So, set 1 slime, you still play the Shizu pants. Shizu pants from set 1 till now, still good. Still your combo of what you're looking for at 1. You're playing into the memory package much more heavily in set 1. You're playing into that mask event as well, that search tools to be able to get it. Really strong play with being the Ricky into the mask bonder at 0. So you all of a sudden you're sitting pretty big on board at 0. You have the filter to be able to get then the event that's going to go to memory, which you also use to get your combo piece, or you can use that to be able to get and thin out your deck a little bit later. You are able to really kind of just dive in and compress as hard as you can through memory. It's about the only deck right during this season that memory compression is really like a viable strategy here. You're playing for these early plays, specifically that Shizu early play that has the condition of having the 2 of level 1 combo in memory. But that's its only condition. So as soon as you have 2 of those in memory, it's basically a conditionless early play that you can kind of spam over and over again, sitting at 10-5 with hand on core. So you can try to keep those big bodies on field. But realistically, really playing into that heal spam strategy. Some decks didn't even run the top end, just trying to spam more and more healers with a salvage trigger at the top. Others played into that salvage trigger combo, which was a very expensive combo for a burn 2 restand. So just trying to, but still they would play it because the combo itself was a healer. So you're just healing constantly, trying to play into that compression game.
Yeah, I remember playing into slime during this time and going, man, there's just nothing I can do because you're 8 out of 21. Like you just could not pop off and actually kill slime unless you had some excellent decompression tools, or unless you like pushed it into 2 so it didn't get its clock compression. Like it would just send 8 cards to memory by the time it was level 2, and it's like, what do you even do? So it was very powerful. Despite not having a very powerful top end, it had such good compression that it would extend the game by that extra turn or 2. It just refused to take the damage, and whenever it did, it would always heal off, because again, at this point, closing from 3-0 was not a lock, especially into that kind of compression. So slime at the time was extremely obnoxious, and if you wanted to play specifically into anti-memory, there wasn't a whole lot of anti-memory tech to go around. And slime also wasn't it wasn't the biggest thing in the meta necessarily, so you might not even be able to extend the slot in your deck to deal with it. So slime was well positioned, and it did well for itself, and honestly, it's continued to do well in many ways with the very same package that it was doing well with 2.5 years ago.
Slime was like a nightmare to queue into back then. It was like unkillable. Like if they had even a couple lucky cancels, it became really hard to like wrench back the game. If they even got like one kind of quote unquote free turn on some like first deck cancels or something like that, they could like really run away with the game. But there was a lot of game to play. So there were a lot of ways you could kind of grind them out. Decks that hated on early plays were really good against slime. Fate, notably, with the bombs, like denying them from ever getting their Shizu condition. Because it wasn't like how slime is even now, or even before set 3, with just set 2. At least at set 2, you can just hedge your bets and like go for your last shot combo at the top with if you're playing Pants Book. Back then, it was like you have nothing. You have nothing other to do than grind out your mid game. So if things went wrong and like you got your Shizus denied, well, things actually started to look pretty bad for you. Because your only other real option was playing the Wind Top End. And the Wind Top End was fine, but like that was a deck that really leveraged that a door trigger a lot for getting that, like, you know, free extra cards to keep healing.
So that's it. Thank you for joining us. Hopefully, you found this as a useful guide to the Lost format. Run it at your locals. Talk to the people that you play Weiss with. This is an interesting format. It's different from the way that we're playing Weiss right now. It's much more interesting in a lot of ways. It allows you to play some stuff that maybe it's been sitting on the shelf for a long time. A highly competitive format with a lot of viable options. We are talking about how we're going to do some stuff with Lost format in the future, so be on the lookout for that. We're definitely going to be making more videos about it. So keep an eye on that kind of stuff, both here and on the Pittsburgh side of things. And hopefully we'll have some stuff for you very soon. Thank you, Carmen, for joining us for this. We appreciate you being here. If you want to shout out anything you want to shout out, go for it.
Yeah, I always love being here. Shout out, obviously, Pittsburgh Weiss Schwarz and my sponsor, Strictly Broken. If you are looking to play some of these old things, I know it's really hard to get your hands on some of these old English cards. Definitely consider, you know, allowing Japanese versions of legal cards for this format if you're planning to play in paper. Or if you don't have these things in paper, you can try on Weiss Fight or the mod of the automated simulator that I have been working on. I just recently finished going over all the cards and removing literally everything from the simulator that isn't a legal card for play in the format, so you don't have to like worry about if a card is legal or not if you just download that mod of the simulator, which we can link in the description.
Yep.
You everything that is in that simulator is what is legal, so there's no questions. You just download, play. What you have access to is what you can play, so no questions there. And that's my whole reason for doing that is I really do want to maybe run some online events and stuff for this in the future. With Clock Tower here. It would be super cool, and the simulator will be a really easy way to do it, you know, just for fun, just for bragging rights and stuff like that.
Yeah. And we'll keep you all viewers updated on any progress that is made towards that end. And these aren't even just the decks that you can play. Like, there are so many others. It definitely opens things up to stuff that's a lot older in the English Weiss world. So definitely worth looking at the very least. Grab the simulator. It's free. Grab the mod on the simulator. Like Carmen said, it'll be in the description. Build some decks and run it. Run it with your friends. Run it against the AI and see how it feels to play some of these older.
A lot more forethought,
Yeah.
I think, in this meta. You know, playing ahead is really important. The farther you can look ahead, because you don't have as many utility options, and take plays in accordance with your game plan, looking ahead, you're rewarded a lot more because you don't have the utility to kind of rip things out of the ether that you do nowadays.
So yeah, give it a shot. We will have updates for you hopefully soon on some online events for this format, and of course, post here. Thank you once again for joining us, Carmen. Thank you for listening. We will be back on Thursday. Until next time, thank you so much for joining us. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe, and have a good
We'll see you then.